I suggest getting a snack or a drink, something like that, because, well, I've never been accused of being concise, so. What's up, friends? My name is Jess. Welcome back to my channel. If you've been watching my channel for a little while, you know that I used to do monthly wrap-ups, but I stopped doing them. That's because I decided I wanted to try doing recent reads instead. I just wanted to free up video slots for other ideas that I had besides wrap-ups, so that's why I decided to try this out. And my plan is to do recent reads for a chunk of 3 months. So there would be 4 recent reads videos throughout the entire year. This video is for January through March. Yes, I recognize that I am filming this in May and it's probably not going to go up until first week of June or something like that. So I'm very, very late, but we are here and you're still getting reviews of books. So whatever. I have no idea how many books I actually read throughout those 3 months. I'm gonna pop the number up on the screen so that you can see, but I read a lot of books and I'm not a very concise person because I like to kind of go and cover all aspects of a book and what I really liked and what I didn't like and give you a good summary of it. So I take a while to talk about each book. This is all just to say that I'm going to get started now and I'm gonna try to, speak a little bit fast to try to get through it quicker so you don't have to be here forever. And you're probably gonna notice me looking down at my phone because normally I try to memorize what I'm going to say in front of the camera, but that's just impossible considering how many books I'm going to talk about. So we're going to start off with New Year's Eve Murder by Meier, which I gave 2 stars to. If you've been watching my videos for a bit, you've probably heard me mention Christmas Cookie Murder, which is by the same author. Both of these books take place in the same universe, following Lucy Stone, who is a regular old mom and a small town reporter who just happens to find herself in the middle of a bunch of dangerous mysteries. I've only read these 2 books in the universe, but I'm pretty sure they're classified as cozy mysteries. This particular book takes place after the Christmas Cookie Murder book, and it follows Lucy and her college-aged daughter after they've won a trip to New York for a makeover competition that has a big cash prize. And of course, when there's money on the line, is it any surprise when people start getting poisoned? I was honestly so disappointed. My goal in reading this was to eventually read all the Lucy Stone books in the time that they were supposed to be read. So this is New Year's Eve Murder, and then there's a St. Patrick's Day one, there's an Easter one, But after reading this, that's not happening. I'm not reading any more Lucy Stone books. I loved Christmas Cookie Murder, and it obviously had its problems because it's an older book and it has some outdated views, but those outdated views were not as prevalent in that book as it is right here. I just couldn't ignore them. I couldn't ignore these views, and they're exactly what you would expect from like a problematic older white woman. There was a lot of internalized misogyny, a lot of judgment and cattiness between the women that were taking part in the competition, but the biggest issue that I can remember is regarding body image. Granted, this may be expected from an older book that's centered around a makeover competition, but the discussions and the views about eating disorders was uncomfortable. In the book's own defense, at no point are eating disorders treated like they're a good thing. Some of the girls just display some really concerning behavior and it's not nearly as addressed as it should have been. And in relation to that, there was also quite a bit of fat phobia that was just, it was off-putting. And if you have struggled with eating disorders in the past, I suspect that this might be triggering for you. This book was just everything that I didn't like about Christmas Cookie Murder and nothing that I did like about it. It was entirely lacking the cozy aspect because it takes place in New York instead of a small town, and to be fair, it also doesn't have the Christmas season to cozy it up either. But the reality is that the coziness of the mystery is what made Christmas Cookie Murder worth reading in the first place. And so because it wasn't in this book, it's like, why did I even read this? The plots aren't stellar. These books are essentially just fillers for when you want to read something in between other books that take more mental energy. This just wasn't a good filler. I wouldn't recommend it. And then the year continued on painfully with The Vampire Lestat by Anne Rice, which I gave 3 stars to. This is the sequel to Interview with a Vampire, which I read, I think, at the end of last year. I'm gonna be real honest with you. The only reason that I read Interview with a Vampire and then The Vampire Lestat is because I happened to have The Queen of the Damned in my physical TBR, and if I wanted to read that and get it off my TBR shelf, I needed to read the first 2. Spoiler, this didn't end well. Don't be like me and continue to drag yourself through books that just aren't for you, because it was a painful time. Personally, I just found it really boring. The concept itself I liked. In the first book, you're introduced to Lestat through the perspective of Louis, who is detailing his life story and how he became a vampire and his life thereafter, including a lot of Lestat's kind of abhorrent behavior. And then this book is kind of refuting Louis' story, going beyond the story of Interview with a Vampire and then casting doubt on everything that was said in the first book, essentially. But the execution was just dreadful. The writing style in this book is similar to the writing style in Interview with a Vampire in that it's really dense. Some of the descriptions just take so long to get through. The pacing is also super slow. It's similar to Interview with a Vampire in all the ways that I didn't want it to be, but it was also different in a very weird way. At times, especially in the first chapter, this book read a lot like fanfiction. And don't get me wrong, I have a lot of respect for fanfiction, but I'm not talking about the good kind of fanfiction here. I'm talking about bad fanfiction. I'm talking about My Immortal. If you know, you know. And if you do know My Immortal, I suggest you read the first page or two of The Vampire Lestat because I think you're gonna find it hilarious. It's just uncanny, the similarities between them. The latter part of the book was a little bit better. I think 2/3 of the way in, you get part 7, and part 7 is all about the origin story of vampires as a whole, you know, how they came to be in this world, and I found it really interesting. I loved getting a little bit more of the mythological lore aspect to the story. It got a little darker, the pacing picked up. Honestly, just read part 7 and ignore the rest of the book. Part 7 is worth reading. Everything else, not so much. The lore is interesting and well thought out. All the rest of the writing style and the plot is just kind of a no from me. It started off on the wrong foot because the very foundation of this book, where Lestat has ended up in his life after separating from Louis, is just so weird and I can't get behind it and it's just ridiculous. It did end up picking up Queen of the Damned towards the end of March, but I ended up DNFing it. I went through the first 2 books and then I ended up DNFing the book that I read those 2 for. I don't even think I made it through 100 pages. I just couldn't keep putting myself through this really weird bad mix of bad fan fiction and dense classical writing. The next book that I read was Mistress of Rome by Kate Quinn, which I gave 4 stars to. This is the first book that I read for the Purging Romance Books video, which I will link in the cards, put in the description. I'll put it somewhere so that you can watch it. But because I do talk about this book in that vlog, I'm not really gonna go into my review of it here. For all of the books that I talk about in the Purging Romance video, I'm only gonna give you a synopsis of the book, and then if you really want a review, you can go to that video and go to the end where I give spoiler-free reviews of all of them. Now, Mistress of Rome is a historical fiction book taking place in ancient Rome. We're following a slave girl named Thea who has recently been bought for Lepida, a spoiled heiress. Life as Lepida's slave is difficult, but Thea manages to find a light in the dark when she starts having a romance with Rome's most famous gladiator, who unfortunately Lepida wants for herself. The next book that I read for that video was Dear John by Nicholas Sparks, which I gave 2 stars to. As you can see, the beginning of this year was not very good. This is a pretty classic romance, so I'm sure you have an idea of what the book is about. This book follows John, who, after he drops out of high school and doesn't know what to do with his life, ends up enlisting in the army. While on leave, he meets Savannah, the girl of his dreams, and after a whirlwind romance, the two decide to continue their relationship after John leaves to continue his enlistment. But 9/11 changes everything, and like many other people in the military, John decides to re-enlist, which puts a strain on their relationship. The next book is Memoirs of a Teenage Amnesiac by Gabrielle Zevin, which I gave 3 stars to. This follows our main character Naomi, who by chance ends up hitting her head on the steps of her school and losing her memory entirely. She can't remember her best friend or her parents' divorce or her boyfriend. Only person she can remember is James, a boy with a gray past who she would never have looked at otherwise, had he not been the one to find her. Next up is Water for Elephants by Sara Gruen, which I gave 4 stars to. Maybe leaning a little bit more towards 3 stars now that I think about it, but I'm gonna leave it at 4 stars because I don't do half stars. This is another historical fiction, although it takes place around the Great Depression era in America. After being suddenly orphaned, our main character Jacob ends up dropping out of vet school during his final exam and is left with no clue what to do. One night he stumbles upon a circus that's passing through and becomes enamored with Marlena, one of the circus performers. Jacob manages to snag a spot as the circus vet, where he meets a whole cast of characters and animals, including the untrainable elephant Rosie and Marlena's short-tempered husband. Next up we have Time Traveler's Wife by Audrey Niffenegger, which I gave 4 stars to. This is the last book that I read in the Purging Romance series, so after this book you will start to get reviews again. For the synopsis of this book, I did pull it directly from Goodreads because it just has the most comprehensive summary, better than any I could give. Audrey Niffenegger's innovative debut, The Time Traveler's Wife, is the story of Claire, a beautiful art student, and Henry, an adventuresome librarian, who have known each other since Claire was 6 and Henry was 36, and were married when Claire was 23 and Henry 31. Impossible but true, because Henry is one of the first people diagnosed with chronodisplacement disorder. Periodically, his genetic clock resets and he finds himself misplaced in time, pulled to moments of emotional gravity in his life, past and future. His disappearances are spontaneous, his experiences unpredictable, alternately harrowing and amusing. If you are interested in reading this book, I highly recommend you watch my Purging Romance video and the spoiler-free review at the end to get some possible trigger warnings, because there are some problematic things here. After that, we start having a little bit of a better time. I end up reading Mongrels by Stephen Graham Jones, which I give 5 stars to, the first 5 stars of the year. This is a paranormal horror story which follows a young boy who has lived his entire life on the outskirts of society with his aunt and uncle, who are mongrels, which are essentially werewolves slash shapeshifters. For 10 years, their family has been one step ahead of the law, trying to hide their grisly secret. And now, it's time to see if our main character has inherited the gene and become a werewolf as well. Now, a fair warning, if you don't like being confused sometimes, don't read this author's works. His writing style is a little bit vague at times, a little bit convoluted, a little bit confusing. You definitely have to put some effort into figuring out what's going on in his books, at least the 2 that I have read so far, but it's 100% worth figuring out, so I would recommend it. Just be aware that it takes some mental effort, although to be fair, that might just be my own lack of brain cells, so I don't know, maybe it'll be easier for you. That being said, if you like coming-of-age stories and you like werewolves, you'll probably really like this book. I adore the logistics of what it's actually like to live as a werewolf. Stephen Graham Jones took a very fantastical, mythological, horrific story of werewolves and he made it real. It's dark and gory and it's definitely horror, but more so it's as real as it gets. If werewolves actually existed, I can't imagine them existing in any other way besides the way that they're described in this book. From the descriptions of their transformations to all of the little tricks and habits in their day-to-day lives, it all just makes so much sense to me. I wish I could give you an example, but I'm not going to go into detail about any of the logistics of being a werewolf because in my opinion, the most fun part of this book is learning more about the werewolves and learning how they live their lives. In terms of the plotline, it's a little bit weaker. I think this story is more character-driven than it is plot-driven, although the latter part of the book does have a very clear plotline. The only thing is that plotline all happens just so quickly that I don't consider it an overarching plotline. This story is more so about our unnamed main character and him trying to figure out if he has become a werewolf, and if he hasn't, what does that mean? He has spent his whole life assuming that he is a werewolf as well, and the idea that he might not be is terrifying. It would entirely ruin his own self-identity, and he's worried that it would also ruin his relationship with his family, who are all werewolves. This book is really about those emotions, and I thought they were explored really well. I would 100% recommend this book. Again, just be aware that it's not handed to you, you have to put in a little bit of work for it. The next book that I read was The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab, which I gave 4 stars to. Yes, I jumped on this bandwagon, and you know what? I liked it. I liked it there. This is the story of Addie LaRue, who in 1714 desperately makes a deal with a dark god in order to escape her arranged marriage. The catch? She becomes immortal and is cursed to be forgotten by everyone she meets. Throughout the book, we get snippets of what this means for Addie as she lives through 300 years all over the world until she finally stumbles into a bookshop and finds a man who remembers her name. This book is undoubtedly not for someone who prioritizes plot and action. That's not what this book was written for, in my opinion. The thing is, I think it's hard to truly say what this book was written for because it just feels like it's a part of V.E. Schwab's heart on paper, and it's hard to translate that into a plot. It's hard to really say what the purpose here was. If you're expecting adventurous stories of Addie living through historical events, you're going to be disappointed. All of the events, even the ones that take place in the present, are kind of a vague backdrop to the emotions. I thought this book was beautifully written. I didn't always like the plot, and I didn't always like the characters, to be honest, but I always loved the writing style of it. I want to own this book simply because it is a perfect example of how beautiful words can be. And if you go into this book for that, then you're absolutely going to love it. We do get a lovely romance that's prominent in the book, and you could interpret this book as a romance story, but that's also not how I'm interpreting it. I think this is fundamentally a story about wanting to leave your mark. This is just about a girl who wants to be remembered, who wants to create, who wants to feel like she matters enough to continue existing after she's gone. If you can relate to that idea, maybe you'll emotionally connect to the broader story and forgive the book its faults, because in that it portrays it very well. Our main love interest also comes with his own deep emotional goal, and it's just as heartbreaking and relatable. What this book does very well is describing those deep personal emotions in the individual characters. I will admit, a part of me was a little bit disappointed because this book was marketed as a love story with the devil, and I saw where that came from. I get why it was marketed that way, but it isn't. That's not what it is. I wish that had been explored more, and I wish this book had been a little bit darker, which is my wish for a lot of books, to be fair, but I respect this book for what it was. Be aware that this book does kind of have an open ending, and just an ending in general that people may not like. I think it's a polarizing ending whether or not you're gonna enjoy it. I don't know. This is a tricky book to be objective about. If what I've said so far interests you, go for it. Try the book out. But it either is or isn't for you. The next book that I read is Follow Me to Ground by Sue Rainsford, which I gave 4 stars to. This book follows Ada and her father as they use their healing powers to cure sick locals, whether that means cracking open their bodies, temporarily removing their lungs, or burying them in the dangerous magical ground outside of their home. Their lives pass relatively undisturbed until Ada starts an affair with a human man named Samson. This is a weird little book. Body horror plays a central role in this book, so be aware of that before you pick it up. Personally, I really like the magic in this book. Rainsford is an expert at making you feel kind of squeamish and uncomfortable. She isn't the first person to come up with healing powers by far, but I do think that she pushes the boundary of that idea to make it into something that's uniquely hers. It's just a very physical magic where you don't just wave your hands and things happen, but I'm not going to say more than that because I think it's quite the experience to learn more about how their magic works and how their healing works. Mind you, I love the writing style. We have some parts that are kind of very vague, but then we have some lines where the weird stuff is said so matter-of-factly, like a slap in the face. It's a pretty unsettling read, and you're never really given the opportunity to get a solid footing either. They want you to be unsettled. I don't know any other way to describe this besides saying that if a flinch could take physical form, it would be this book. To be fair, I do think this book will disturb you, but I don't think it'll scare you. It's just a dawning sort of horror as you slowly start to realize what exactly is going on here, and trust me, it's not going to be something that you expect. Beyond that, I also thought this book raised some interesting questions about morality and what it means to be human, because Ada and her father aren't really human. My only real disappointment is that this book had an open ending, and I was a little bit unsatisfied with that. I understand why the author did it the way she did, but I was left with some questions that I wanted answered, and if the book had been even 50 more pages, maybe I would have been happier about it. The next book that I read was Tweet Cute by Emma Lord, which I gave 5 stars to. This is a YA contemporary romance between 2 teenagers, Pepper and Jack. Pepper is your classic overachiever who is barely managing to juggle her own life while also trying to manage her family's major nationwide company, Big League Burger's Twitter account. Jack works at his family's local deli and occasionally sends out a tweet or 2 himself. But those tweets or 2 turns into many, many tweets because they find out that Big League Burger may have copied their grandma's grilled cheese recipe, and they are not going to take that lying down. Pepper and Jack are waging a Twitter war against each other in the public eye, but privately, they are falling for each other on an anonymous chat app. This book is just so cute. I was very hesitant at first because there are a few things here that I typically don't like. First, romance is one of my least favorite genres. Contemporaries are also for the most part boring to me, especially YA contemporaries. Plus, on top of that, I hate references to social media or pop culture in books. In the past, they've just made me cringe. So the fact that I ended up loving this despite all of those things is a miracle. Emma Lord just happens to be really good at 2 other things that I love, which is banter and tension. Pepper and Jack just have such good chemistry and banter with each other. The only reason that I actually liked the Twitter war going on between them was because it was just them poking and having fun with each other. And in terms of romantic tension, it's just so good. There were parts that were so cute that made me just smile and internally squeal a little bit. It made me so happy. And by the way, there is nothing graphic here at all. They're just 2 teenagers that are really cute. In terms of all other kinds of tension between characters, it was aggravating in the best way. Familial relationships and how Pepper and Jack feel in their families played a major role in the story. This book just made me feel so many things. Let me just say that all of the family members, except maybe one, made me feel so angry. So angry. I can't even explain to you. I'm angry now thinking about it. Anyway, there were some flaws to the book though. My rating system isn't very objective. It's somewhere between objective and I'm just going off my vibes. The reason this book got 5 stars is mostly just because it made me really happy. That being said, I did feel like a lot of the familial tension was only surface level resolved, and we missed out on some scenes that I would have really loved to have. I also questioned the anonymous app plotline because I just thought it was unnecessary. I don't really think we needed the app to get the story that we got. The next book that I read was The Happiness Project by Gretchen and Rubin, which I gave 3 stars to. This is a nonfiction self-help book that basically centers around feeling happier. So Gretchen Rubin does this sort of experiment where each month she focuses on improving a different aspect of her life, whether that's family, being kinder, different things in the pursuit of being happier. The reason I picked this up is honestly because I was doing something similar in my life at the time. I had listed different categories of my life in which I thought I could improve and hopefully improve my quality of life and therefore feel happier after doing so. And then each week I would choose one of those categories, do things that I thought would help improve that, and see what stuck and what didn't. I thought it was very helpful to me at the time, and I was hoping to get some ideas from this book, but I didn't really get any ideas. This book is kind of written from a privileged perspective, and the author herself notes that she comes from a kind of privileged life and she's generally happy. She doesn't really have any worries in her life. Sometimes the book comes across a little tone deaf, and the suggestions to be happier in this book just don't work for everyone. It's just not possible for everyone. If you're interested in it and this is something that you want to do for your own life, you know, be happier, then go for it. I don't think her exact experiment will work for a lot of people, but maybe it'll inspire you to do your own kind of happiness project and it'll give you some ideas for what would work for you. After this, I read the Red Rising trilogy by Pierce Brown, so that's Red Rising, Golden Sun, and Morning Star. All 3 of those books got 4 stars. This series takes place in a dystopian world where humans have started to move to different planets. Our main character Darrow is a part of the Red Caste, which is the lowest caste in society. He and his fellow Reds work under the surface of Mars in the hopes of making the planet livable for humanity in the next few generations. But when Darrow realizes that humanity has reached the surface many, many years ago, he comes to the crushing realization that he and his fellow Reds have just been kept as slaves. Broken and bitter, Darrow decides to leave everything behind in the hopes of infiltrating the highest caste and bringing them down from the inside. This is a very good series, although it's probably not the best introduction for somebody new to sci-fi. I will say the first book is a very contained world. It's very easily digestible, kind of has a Hunger Games-esque setup once you really get into it, but it's 100% for an older crowd because it's more complex and it's more violent and dark. War, battles, and politics are central to this series. There's a lot of strategy that goes behind the events in these books, and after the first book, the universe just explodes. It expands, there are so many moving parts, so many battles to keep track of, and it honestly gets very confusing. Even so, I don't really feel like I missed out on anything. There were parts that were confusing, and it was a little bit hard to keep track of all the strategies and plans going on, but even if I was confused, I don't think I missed out on anything central. You know, I don't need to know the ins and outs of all the spaceships going around to really get the plot. Honestly, hats off to Pierce Brown, because the battle strategies that happen in these books all seem very complex to me, but they do make sense. And not just because he's the author and he's capable of making it make sense, they just seem like solid battle strategies, and they're clever enough that I could never really guess them. I could never stay ahead of the characters and try to guess what they would do. Now, the cast premise isn't anything new. Even so, this feels different, and part of it is because Pierce Brown is somebody who pays such close attention to detail. It's so easy to slip into the world because it's so detailed and complex and there's so much depth to it. You can tell that Pierce Brown put a lot of thought into building this world. You can tell that they put effort into it. I also really love the characters. All of them are so well done, and there's a really big range of character types. All of them are nuanced from the beginning, but they only get more complex as the series goes. The relationships, both platonic and romantic, are just so good and layered, and they develop kind of naturally. And I love that even though romance is kind of important and it's happening, it's not the most important thing, and it doesn't overwhelm the plot because the characters have more important things to do than just have a romance. I will say, I didn't root for all of the relationships, but you know what, I can live with the romantic relationship that I didn't like. It didn't ruin the series for me, I just wasn't about it. Brown also does really well with banter and organic, real interactions between people. I would love to get a physical copy of this series only to annotate my favorite interactions between characters. If you like this premise, if you like character relationships in the middle of a huge sci-fi world, read the series. I thought it was great. After that, I read Home Before Dark by Riley Sager, which I gave 3 stars to. 25 years before the events of this book, our main character Maggie and her parents move into Baneberry Hall. They only last 3 weeks before fleeing from the home in the middle of the night, terrified. Their trauma and fear was immortalized in an internationally famous book written by Maggie's father, who claims that the house was haunted. Now as an adult, Maggie loathes the book, discounting everything in it as a lie. But when her father passes away and she finds herself the new owner of Baneberry Hall, she decides to go back to the home after 25 years and renovate it in the hopes of also finding answers to the story along the way. Maybe, just maybe, there was some truth to her father's book after all. This book was entertaining enough. That's the main thought that I'm gonna have here. It was entertaining enough. I really like that we get alternating chapters here, where we get Maggie's perspective in the present as she's renovating the house, and then we also get chapters from her father's book. And I loved seeing the parallels between events and seeing the tension slowly build up as Maggie realizes, you know, some of these details were true and some of these events seem to be true, and she's really not sure just how true her father's book was after all. The story just wasn't as intense as I hoped for. That's basically it. The plot twist in theory would have been great, but I don't think the delivery was too hot. It was very anticlimactic when it should have been a jaw dropper. It's like the difference between popping a balloon and deflating a balloon, if that makes sense. The characters also weren't as nuanced as I would have liked, and in all honesty, Maggie was annoying sometimes. They were just kind of one-dimensional and they didn't go as deep as I would have liked, which is the general feeling about the book. Generally surface level. And while I liked what we got on the surface, I wasn't in love with it because Riley Sager didn't go as deep as I would have liked in the plot and in the intensity and in the characters. So while entertaining, I wouldn't call this book memorable. If it sounds interesting to you, go for it. If you liked the show The Haunting of Hill House on Netflix, you might also like this because I got a similar vibe from both of them. It's not a waste of your time. I'm definitely going to try more Riley Sager books later. Take from that what you will. After that, I read The Six of Crows duology by Leigh Bardugo. I gave Six of Crows 4 stars, and then I gave Crooked Kingdom 5 stars. This duology takes place in the Grishaverse sometime after the events of the Shadow and Bone trilogy. We're following a new cast of characters in Ketterdam, which is an international hub for trade, but more importantly, the home to many criminals, including our little band of teen prodigies. This is the synopsis description of our main characters: a convict with a thirst for revenge, a sharpshooter who can't walk away from a wager, a runaway with a privileged past, a spy known as the Wraith, a heartrender using her magic to survive the slums, a thief with a gift for unlikely escapes. Those 6 people are coming together in this duology to perform the heist of their lives. Now, I don't know if this comparison will make any sense, but the vibe that I got from this duology is a mixture between the TV show Leverage and The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. You know, you've got a crew, all with their own individual talents, coming together to build schemes, and along the way they become a family. But where the Leverage crew is doing everything that they're doing for noble reasons, the Crows are darker. They've got good hearts, don't get me wrong, but they're violent and they're not afraid of that. This is absolutely a character-driven story. Now, don't get me wrong, I enjoyed the plot, it was interesting, and it was cool to see how they built together the scheme and how all the pieces of the heist came together. All of that was interesting, but I don't remember the heist half as well as I remember the details of the characters. If you don't like the characters in these books, you're not gonna like the books. This series switches perspective, so you get into the mind of all 6 main characters, and you get their backstories, you start to learn their motivations and who they are, and each character is just so nuanced. I was still learning new things about them as we were going through the second book, and the character development was phenomenal. It's not rushed or forced, and it's so clear. Honestly, when I think back on the first book and I think of how far they've come individually and in their relationships, I get a little bit emotional. I care a lot about these characters, and I care a lot about their relationships as well. The romantic relationships in these books took my breath away. Each relationship is so different different from each other, but they're all so good in their own ways. Six of Crows made me dive back into fanfiction after I hadn't read any for a long while. And their relationship as a group, even better. I think that's the reason why Cricket Kingdom ended up getting 5 stars instead of 4 stars like the first book got. Because in the first book, they're still trying to get to know each other, and they don't really trust each other. And while their banter and their interactions are still good, Cricket Kingdom was better to me because at that point, they were a team. Instead of individuals just dealing with each other in order to get their end goal, they were a team working for the same cause. Again, I just care about these characters so much. I loved the bonds between them. I loved them. I haven't read Shadow and Bone in quite a while, but I think this duology is better than the original trilogy. After Six of Crows, I read the Three Dark Crowns series by Kendare Blake. The first 2 books got 3 stars, and then the second 2 books got 4 stars. In this series, a set of triplets is born every generation, all 3 with equal claims to the throne and queens in their own right. Each one also has her own powerful magic. In this generation, we have an elementalist, a poisoner who is immune to all kinds of poisons, and a naturalist who can control animals and plants. When the queens turn 16, it becomes a battle to the death because only one queen is allowed to live and claim the crown. I honestly wish I could tell you why I continued and finished this series after the first book, because I didn't enjoy the first book that much, but I kept going anyway. And honestly, I feel like the reason the last 2 books got 4 stars is out of some sense of Stockholm syndrome where I just had to believe that I was enjoying it more than I actually was. To be clear, these are not bad books. A 3-star rating is a good rating. My issue with it is that it's fairly predictable. If you have read enough YA books, especially YA books in this era, then you get a sense for the common paths these books take. The biggest example of this is that I guessed the plot twist of the first book in the first 70-ish pages or so. And I mean the plot twist that they dropped in the literal last sentence of the first book, as if it was some jaw-dropping revelation or something like that. I just wasn't overly shocked with anything. I loved the world building and I loved the magic system. Different people developing different powers isn't anything unique at all, although I haven't heard of poisoners before, but the world and the culture that these powers are set in is what's interesting to me. I love the concept of triplet queens, and I also think it's cool that this kingdom actually exists within our world, but it's hidden behind a mist and only a few people still remember that the kingdom exists. The characters did start to grow on me as the series continued. In the beginning, they were very surface level. They were who they were, and that's all they were. I don't know if that made any sense, but let me put it this way. I can succinctly describe all of the sisters with like one word, okay? You have the caring sister, the juvenile or the rash sister, and then the cruel one. And if you have read these books, it is not hard at all for you to guess which one's which. It's only later that they become more interesting and more complex, and you start to see different motivations in them. I guess that's why the last 2 books started getting 4 stars, because as you get into the latter half of the series, the plot also gets more complex and interesting. I'll admit, the first book in particular is the one that I was the least happiest with, because the pacing was just so slow to me. It took so long to get to what I felt like was the main event of the book, and even then, it carried on to book 2. The pacing did improve a bit as the series went on, and it got more intense, so I guess I'm kind of glad that I kept going. I don't know, it was overall idly entertaining, but mostly because I just wasn't in the mood to read any other book in particular, so I just read this. The next book is Silence of Bones by June Her, which I gave 4 stars to. This is a historical mystery novel that takes place in what later becomes Korea in 1800. We're following Seal, a teen indentured to the police bureau. In this time period, it would be disrespectful for men to handle female witnesses or female victims, so Seal helps facilitate that. This is how she ends up in the middle of an investigation into a politically charged murder of a noblewoman. Throughout the investigation, she also develops a friendship with the inspector, but when it turns out that the inspector is the prime suspect for the murder, Seal's loyalties are put to the test. I thought the setting in the time period were very interesting. I've never read a book either set in Korea or set in this time period, I think, and I ended up learning some things about historical Korean culture, so that was cool. This does read a little bit like a classic crime fiction novel, but it's more reflective and character-driven in my opinion. It doesn't have a very fast pace, and the plotline of the murder feels almost secondary to the internal feelings of the characters. We know early on that the reason Seal moved and became indentured is because she's searching for her brother who went missing many years ago, and her feelings about that impact her relationship with the inspector. There's a lot here about family and forming relationships and what it means to be loyal, especially when loyalty sometimes conflicts with integrity, because we're kind of dealing with 2 plot lines here, the murder investigation and then Seal's search for her brother. We have multiple plot twists. The only thing I'm going to say about that is that I guessed one with the plot twist, but I could have never seen the other one coming, so. There were some flaws to the book. Sometimes Seal was frustrating as hell, and the book takes a while to get into, but I think it's worth it. I think it's worth trying out, because if this book is the book for you, then you're gonna love it and it's going to touch your heart. Alright, next up we have A Man Called Uwe by Fredrick Backman, which I gave 5 stars to. This is probably my favorite book in the entire video. This book follows Uwe, an elderly man described as grumpy, bitter, short-tempered, you get the picture. But when a bubbly young family moves in next door and starts inserting themselves into his solitary life, you start to learn the story behind the man and the sadness that's crept in. Let me give you a bit of a warning. This book does deal with suicide. Throughout the book, Uwe is attempting to commit suicide, and we learn that very early on in the book, but I will say I don't think it's graphic, and I also don't think this is a dark story at all. This book has such an absurd style of writing that I think it's impossible for it to be dark or brooding, and I wish I could describe the style of writing better. The only thing I can do is say that it compares to Good Omens or The Girl Who Saved the King of Sweden in my mind. It's a very deadpan sort of humor where the most mundane things suddenly become hilarious because of the delivery. This book has a lot of ordinary life events which would normally bother me, but because of the way it was written, I didn't care. It made me laugh out loud multiple times. Here, let me just read a paragraph to see if I can give you a sense of what it's like. Okay, so this is on page 3, very early on. There are no spoilers. The sales assistant rubs his palm against the edge of the counter and shifts his weight nervously from foot to foot, as young men employed in retail outlets often do when they begin to understand that something is going to take considerably more time than they had initially hoped. That was a very short taste, and I'm not even sure if it was the best example for what I'm trying to say, but hopefully you got a taste of it. I don't know. I actually listened to this as an audiobook, and I would 100% recommend listening to the audiobook because the narrator was so good at delivering the lines the way they should be. Even with how absurd the writing style is though, this is a pretty sad and pretty emotional story. Obviously, we're following a man who just wants to end his life. We get a lot of his backstory basically from the beginning of his life up to where he is now, which tells us a lot about who he is, and even though he has a very abrasive personality, you can't help but love him. I wouldn't say that this is a story that's going to make you sob or anything, but I definitely think you'll get choked up, especially towards the end. Backman really played with my feelings in the end. I just think this is a great message of love and how you have the potential to affect the people around you in positive ways and how there's always a reason to keep living. I just love this book. The next book I read was Lore by Alexandra Bracken, which I gave 2 stars to. Centuries before this story, the Greek gods staged a rebellion, and in punishment, they are forced to walk as mortals on Earth every 7 years, vulnerable to humans who want to hunt them down and kill them for their immortality. Lore's family participated in this hunt until one day they are brutally murdered by a man who ascends to godhood. Lore leaves the entire life behind, but when 7 years pass, she is dragged back into that world because Athena, gravely wounded and one of the only original gods left, has bound their fates together and given her the only chance of avenging her family. This book is very classically YA, by which I mean the main character is a badass girl with an aggressive attitude who just happens to be good at everything even though she hasn't trained in like 7 years or something. The love interest is bland, although he maybe has a couple interesting characteristics. And then the plot itself feels predictable to a degree, although there was one plot twist that I didn't guess, but it also wasn't stunning either. Nothing was really exciting, and the ending specifically was just straight up disappointing. I don't mind open-ended endings, but this wasn't that so much as it invalidated the entire story. It felt like there was no point to everything the characters went through because nothing really changed in the end, and what little did change just felt cheapened by the way the book ended. There was an attempt at feminism made in this book which revolves around the story of Medusa. Now the story of Medusa is the reason why I was so intrigued in picking up this book in the first place, but it doesn't play a major role at all. It's basically over and done with after a page or 2 conversation between Athena and Lore, and this overarching theme of shallow feminism I think also results in a sexual assault scene that is never processed by the character really. I don't think we ever really see her process what happened. I think it's only used to further that idea that all men are trash. And speaking of things thrown in, there are some side characters who are LGBT and they end up together, but it 100% felt like tokenism. The characters in their relationship aren't developed at all. You just find out that they're queer and then you find out that they're in a relationship, and there's really no reasoning to that. There's no reason why they would have liked each other and why they would have ended up in a relationship. They just do, and it's like, is it only because they were the only gay characters there? I don't know. I just felt so disappointed. I was expecting something different, and that's partially my own fault for expecting something that the book didn't promise me. I don't know. If you're interested in the premise, pick it up, because plenty of people loved it. It just happens to be that this book is kind of polarizing. You either love it or you don't. Next, I read The Testaments by Margaret Atwood, which I gave 3 stars to. This is the sequel to Handmaid's Tale. In case you don't know the premise already, this takes place in a near dystopian future where America has been taken over by a radically religious group and turned into Gilead, a country where women are oppressed and abused in many different ways. The first book was extremely character driven. I remember it being solely from the perspective of a handmaid and just getting her feelings and her recollection of the events that happened leading up to where she was. It was good, but it wasn't necessarily for me because I don't always like character driven. It really has to be solid characters that I love for me to like character driven. The sequel was a bit more my style. The pacing picks up, we're introduced to a lot more characters, we're introduced to more aspects of life in Gilead, and we're seeing how different people live in different classes, in different jobs, things like that. And we also start getting a rebellion. This is where the fight against Gilead picks up. That being said, I do acknowledge that this book was not as harrowing as the first book. And in some ways, I think it would have been better to just leave the book with all of its uncertainties as it was instead of writing a sequel to it. Not all of the perspectives in the second book were good, and some of them were downright obnoxious at times. If you don't raise your expectations too high, I think that you can enjoy this, and I'm glad that I read it because I really like TV shows, so I'm glad to see where the story went here and then be able to watch the show as it progresses and see what the differences are. The next book that I read was Wonder by R.J. Palacio, which I gave 3 stars to. This is a middle grade contemporary story following August Pullman, who wants nothing more than just to be treated like an ordinary kid. Unfortunately, because August was born with some facial deformities, that doesn't happen. The book starts out at the beginning of 5th grade when August starts going to a mainstream school after being homeschooled his entire life. There are some good issues brought up in this book, like bullying and treating people differently for things out of their control and the necessity of being kind. I just don't think it was executed very well, and I question if the author has ever actually had interactions with people with disabilities. I couldn't find any Own Voices reviews of people who are actually disabled and who read this book, so maybe I'm off on my assessment, but I don't know that this is how they would have wanted to be portrayed in a book. It's not at all treating them like normal people, it's almost treating them with pity. Again, the whole point of this book is that August wants to be treated like a normal kid, but the ending completely contradicts that. This is maybe a bit of a spoiler, but at the end of the book, August gets an award, and it's blatantly said, August blatantly knows that he got that award because of his disabilities. That's not treating someone like a normal person, so really, did the point get across? There's also the fact that I feel like August was infantilized a little bit. Granted, this is his first time going to a school and socializing with other children, so he's not as socially developed as, you know, the children who have been going to mainstream school the entire time. But it also feels like he's being treated like he's younger than his peers. There are certain things like crushes that are absolutely normal for a kid his age to have, but it seems like he's not capable of having those things. I could just be reading too much into this, I don't know. This book also has maybe 4 or 5 perspectives, and switching perspectives was kind of valuable in seeing how different people perceive and treat August. I thought the perspective from August's sister was especially interesting because you kind of see her dealing with the fact that she feels neglected by her parents who give August more attention, and she's dealing with the internal conflict of loving her little brother but also feeling like she can't stand on her own identity. That being said, the execution wasn't great. The author uses different spellings, different cases, there's things like that to differentiate the different perspectives. For instance, the sister's boyfriend, his perspective is written exclusively in lowercase and present tense, whereas the other perspectives aren't. And then we have horribly misspelled messages between characters that we have to read. And I just think if you have to do kitschy things like that to differentiate the perspectives, then your control of the tone of each character is maybe not that good. Maybe the intentions behind this story were good. I think they were good intentions, but I don't think the execution was that good. It was a quick read, a bit of a feel-good, and I think there's potential for kids to learn some good lessons from this, so it's just maybe not the best book out there for disability representation. Next up, we have The Dragon's Revenge by Conor Kostick. I gave this book 2 stars, and I feel kind of bad about that. This is a gift from another booktuber couple from a couple books, so I'm still very grateful for this this gift, and I'm glad that I tried it because I do think that I could potentially like the lit RPG genre that this book is a part of, but this is maybe not the book for me. In this book, our main character is one of the best players in an internationally popular MMO RPG game. When an AI dragon goes rogue and prevents the release of the game's continuation, the company recruits Tom to put together a crew, go into the game, and defeat the dragon. As they go, however, they realize there might be something off about this game, and it might have something to do with the cryptocurrency company that's funding it. Maybe someone who's more into video games and MMOs would enjoy this book, but it wasn't for me. Which isn't to say that it's hard to understand. It's not. There are a lot of MMO video game specific terms that are used, but they're all explained well, so I knew what was going on. The problem is that we spend so much of this book just following the characters around as they're leveling up and preparing for the final showdown. There really wasn't a sense of urgency here. It felt like they just lingered in the game for hundreds of pages, and there wasn't a cohesive plotline during that time period, which is why I think someone who enjoys video games might enjoy this more, because they might have just enjoyed the routine work of leveling up a character. The synopsis teases at a conspiracy theory that has to do with cryptocurrency, but the conspiracy is only brought up maybe 2/3 of the way into the book, pretty far in, and it's only briefly discussed before the characters go back in game and they go back to battling enemies in game, all for the purpose of leveling up. But keep in mind, the purpose of the leveling up is to then defeat the dragon in the game. However, the ending is just so anticlimactic. It was over with in about a page, so it felt like 90% of the book was exposition. The main group of characters are mildly nuanced. You know that they're in this for more than just liking the game, and you know that they have their own motivations, but they're not really explored, and they also don't really have character development throughout the book, except maybe the main character. I want to say that the main character changed in some way, but I really can't point out how he did. But that might just be my memory, I don't know. I also felt kind of uncomfortable with the way that the only woman in the main group is portrayed. Let's just start with the fact that she is a Japanese woman who basically just has a reputation for being drop dead sexy. The way she was described just felt like fetishization of Asian women. I don't know if I said that word right. It was just over the top, especially when you combine it with the fact that she specifically said that she agreed to do the mission with the hopes of hooking up with the main character, and then when she finds out that the main character is too young, hooking up with an American man because she thought they would be so much better than Japanese men. That's so uncomfortable and messed up on different levels. I don't know, this just wasn't for me. I felt like it could have gone through more rounds of editing and maybe a sensitivity reader. Next, we've got Soul by Patricia McCormick, which I gave 3 stars to. This is a fictionalized story about a very real issue in Nepal. We're following Lakshmi, who is a 13-year-old girl from a poor family. When the family hits a particularly rough spot, her stepfather tells her that she has to leave home and go get a job in order to support them. However, Lakshmi ends up being taken by a woman and sold into prostitution. From there, her story of survival is told in this book in a series of vignettes. I will admit that I was initially uncomfortable with the fact that this is written by a white American woman instead of from people who are closer to the issue and telling their own story, but in her own defense, she is a journalist and she did spend a lot of time researching the topic and interviewing people who had experience with the issue, so I'm sure this was written in good faith. The story is rather limited because it's written entirely from Lakshmi's perspective and she doesn't really leave the brothel. I understand why it was written this way, and it really packed an emotional punch sometimes, specifically because it was written that way. But even so, this felt like a shallow perspective. It felt like it was reducing the entire country down to this one negative aspect about it. And maybe if the author had included some more culture, expanded the world a little bit to show positive aspects of the country, it would have felt a little bit better. And it also maybe would have felt a little bit better if she didn't center Americans so much. It was basically just white people doing the saving. There were some moments where it just felt like she was idealizing Americans and centering them as the saviors, which was a little god complexy. I just don't know what to feel. I didn't find any reviews from people who are from Nepal or India, so I don't know what this story looks like from their perspective. And a part of me feels bad for criticizing this book because I know that the intentions were good, and I know that the purpose of this book was to raise awareness of the issue. And I think that it did that. I think it raised awareness of the issue, but that's where it stops. It doesn't really tell you what to do now that you know this is an issue. It doesn't tell you how to help people. It really doesn't teach you anything beyond the fact that it exists. Alright, we're getting into the last 2 books, the first of which is Ferris by Marissa Meier, which I gave 4 stars to. This is a short novella that takes place in the Lunar Chronicles world. The Lunar Chronicles is a series of loose retellings that take place in a futuristic world where technology has advanced and you have things like cyborgs and robots and whatnot. In this world, the moon has also been colonized by lunars, who are people with the ability to change their appearance appearance and force other people to do what they want them to do. This novella specifically goes into the backstory of Queen Lavanna, who is the main antagonist of the main series. As a note, Meier suggests reading this in between Cress and Winter. I didn't have this book at the time that I read the main series, so I didn't do so, but I do really want to reread the series now having this new perspective of Lavanna. I just love getting villain origin stories, and I feel like this book did such a good job of adding more background to Lavanna and who she is, and it made me sympathize with her. It really did. Her actions were definitely messed up, and at no point do you get the sense that it was okay that she did the things you did, even though you do get her internal monologue of trying to justify it. Her internal monologue was just sad and horrifying, actually. It's sad to imagine the queen that Lavanna could have been if she hadn't gone through the things that she was put through. It's just so clear that Lavanna went through a lot of trauma, and if you read this book, there is a solid theory as to why Lavanna is the way that she is. So if you want to know Lavanna a bit more and you really want to get her motivations, 100% read this book. It's very short, very easy to get through, and I really enjoyed it. And then the last book that I read in March was Stars Above, also by Marissa Meier. I also gave this book 4 stars. This is a short story collection that takes place in the Lunar Chronicles world. For the most part, I loved the stories in this book. There was one story that I wasn't really into because it didn't have any of the characters that we were already introduced to, and it didn't really add any background to the world or the plot, so I wasn't very invested. It was still enjoyable enough, but it felt kind of out of place with the rest of them. I did really like all the other stories though. We got a lot of backstories for a lot of the main characters that we know. You really get to know their motivations and who they are and what's driving them, and I feel like the backstories kind of explain some of the actions that they take in the main series. I just really love the characters and I love getting to know them more. My favorite story was probably the final story in this collection, which takes place after the events of the main series. So if you haven't read the Lunar Chronicles yet, do not read this book because you will get kind of spoiled. But basically, it's just a domestic fluff story. There are so many times as a reader when I'm reading battle intense stories where so many horrible things are happening to the characters, and sometimes I just want a fluffy story where they're like having a movie night or something and I just want to see my favorite characters happy for once. And that final story in this collection finally satisfied that need for some domestic happiness. I do want to give a disclaimer about this series though before ending the video. I love the Lunar Chronicles. It's one of those series that really reminded me why I enjoy reading, but there is a problem with representation in this book. The main setting for the first book, at least, is in what used to be Beijing. The representation here does kind of tend towards presenting different Asian cultures as a monolith, by which I mean Meier takes different aspects from different Asian cultures and kind of throws them together without rhyme or reason. Obviously, I'm not Asian, so I'm not the best person to speak on this. If you look through reviews though, you'll probably find critiques from Asian reviewers who can go more in depth and kind of point out the specific examples of where this is a problem. I wish I could link the video that first brought the issue to my attention, but I can't remember either which creator posted the video or which video specifically it was, because it wasn't a Lunar Chronicles video specifically where she talked about it. Basically, just be aware of that and be aware that the Asian representation in this, not solid, not that great. And that is it. Oh, that was a lot of books. I feel like I made good time though. I hope y'all understood everything that I was saying because I felt like I was rambling at a pretty fast pace. Hopefully I was articulate enough. Please like this video if you enjoyed listening to me ramble about a bunch of different books, and comment below what was your favorite book of 2021 so far, or what was your least favorite book of 2021 so far. In the meantime, make sure that you're subscribed to my channel. I do try to post a video every single week, so if you want more bookish content from me, make sure you're subscribed. I will see you in the next one.